The hearing room was already full when Walter Briggs walked through the side door. People had driven from 3 counties over, some arriving before the building even unlocked. A few had brought lawn chairs and waited in the hallway. By the time the clerk opened the chamber, every seat was taken and a line of people stood pressed against the back wall. Word had spread that Judge Raymond Harlow, the longest-serving circuit judge in Aldrich County, had ordered the demolition of a 103-year-old cattle barn on the Briggs family farm. The county's new building inspector had declared it structurally condemned. Walter had been given 11 days. Most people already knew how these things ended. When a county judge orders a building torn down, the building comes down. That's how it works, but something unusual had happened that morning, because Walter Briggs had arrived carrying a single brick. The bailiff saw it first. He stepped forward near the metal detector and held up one hand. "Sir, you can't bring construction material into a courtroom." Walter stopped. The brick sat in his right palm, reddish-brown, edges worn smooth in places, a thin crust of old mortar still clinging to one side. It weighed about 4 pounds. Dust clung to the creases in his hand. "It's evidence," Walter said. The bailiff looked at the brick, then at Walter, then at the clerk behind the desk. Evidence of what? Walter didn't answer. His lawyer, a woman named Darlene Hess, who had driven 90 minutes from the state capitol, handed the bailiff a printed brief. He read 2 lines, paused, and stepped aside. "Keep it below the table until you're called." Walter nodded. He walked inside and sat down. He placed the brick on his lap. Across the aisle, the county's legal team, 3 attorneys, 2 paralegals, and the building inspector occupied the first 2 rows. They had 14 binders arranged on the table. The building inspector, a man named Craig Overmeyer, glanced at the brick and smiled. "Brought a souvenir," he said quietly to his colleague. The colleague chuckled. Walter didn't look up. Craig Overmeyer had been the county's building inspector for just under 2 years. He was 41, university-trained in structural engineering, and had already condemned 9 buildings since taking office. His inspections were efficient, thorough, and difficult to challenge. He wore a dark gray suit that morning. His laptop was open. His reports were color-coded. On the table beside him sat a 3-dimensional model of the Briggs barn, built from photographs, marked in red where he had identified structural failure. That barn should have come down a decade ago, he had told the county board during a public session 3 weeks earlier. The mud was powder. The roof sags 11 inches off-center. The north wall has visible separation from the foundation. "I wouldn't let a dog sleep in it." The board had voted 4-1 to support the demolition order. Judge Harlow had signed it the same afternoon. The Briggs barn had stood on 87 acres of rolling pasture land just south of the Aldrich County line since 1923. Walter's grandfather, Edwin Briggs, had built it the year he married. He quarried the stone foundation himself, hired a local crew to fire the bricks from clay dug out of the south meadow, and raised the walls over 2 summers. The barn had held dairy cattle, then beef cattle, then hay storage, then equipment. 4 generations had used it. Walter was born in 1959 and couldn't remember a single year when the barn wasn't part of daily life. In 2024, the county had extended a new access road along the edge of the Briggs property. Part of the road's drainage plan required an easement through Walter's land. Walter had agreed, but during the survey an engineer flagged the barn. "Aged masonry structure within 40 feet of the new road grade," the report read. "Recommend structural assessment." That assessment was assigned to Craig Overmeyer. He visited the barn on a Tuesday. He spent 45 minutes. He took photographs, measured the roof sag, tested the mortar with a flathead screwdriver, and filed a 22-page condemnation report within a week. Walter received the demolition order on a Thursday. The notice was printed on county letterhead, 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to a single sentence: "Remove the structure, or the county will do it for you at the owner's expense." Walter sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. His wife Helen stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The barn wasn't just a building. Walter's daughter had taken her first steps on the stone floor near the south entrance. His son had learned to weld in the equipment bay. Every Christmas the family gathered in the hayloft for photographs, a tradition that went back to Walter's mother, who had done the same thing with her parents in the 1940s. The county's assessment had taken 45 minutes. The barn had stood for 103 years. Walter called 3 attorneys that week. The first 2 said the same thing. A condemnation order signed by Judge Harlow was essentially final. The third didn't return his call. It was Helen who found Darlene Hess. She had read about her in a magazine article about historic preservation cases. Darlene's office was 90 minutes away, and she charged more per hour than Walter paid his hired man per week. But when Walter described the barn, hand-fired brick, lime mortar, stone foundation quarried on site, Darlene went quiet for a moment and then said, "I'll drive out tomorrow." She arrived at 7 in the morning. She spent 2 hours in the barn, not measuring walls or testing mortar, but looking at the bricks themselves. She pulled one from a section of interior wall that had been damaged in a windstorm 20 years earlier. She held it up to the light and ran her thumb across the base. "There's a maker's stamp," she said. Walter had never noticed it. He'd looked at those bricks his entire life and never seen the faint pressed letters on the bottom. It gave him 30 days. He appealed. The appeal was denied in 14. The deadline was reduced to 11. His neighbors told him to let it go. "It's just a barn." Walter's wife Helen said nothing. She just looked out the kitchen window toward the barn's roofline and poured another cup of coffee. Walter hired Darlene Hess after 3 local attorneys declined the case. 2 said the condemnation was airtight. 1 said he didn't want to challenge Judge Harlow. Darlene reviewed the inspection report line by line. She found it technically competent. Every measurement was within standard methodology. Every photograph was properly time-stamped. The report followed state code to the letter. "On paper, this is clean," she told Walter. "It did everything by the book. Then how do I fight it?" Walter asked. "The book might be wrong," Darlene said. "It covers buildings built after 1965. Your barn was built in 1923. Different materials, different standards, different century." She filed a motion requesting a delay and an independent assessment. The judge denied the delay. He allowed the assessment, but gave them 9 days. Walter paid $2,400 out of savings from materials historian from the state university. The historian visited on day 5. The historian, Dr. Catherine Voss, spent 3 hours in the barn. She wore a headlamp and carried a small chisel. She tested mortar joints at 14 points. She photographed the maker's stamps on 87 bricks. She mapped the foundation stone by hand. When she finished, she sat on an overturned bucket and looked at Walter. "This barn was built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing," she said. "The mortar is lime-based, designed to flex with the building. It absorbs moisture and releases it seasonally. Portland cement can't do that. If someone cemented over this mortar, the building would crack within a decade." She paused. "Your building inspector tested this barn as if it were built in 1965. It was built in 1923. That's not a minor difference. That's a different science entirely." Well, Walter asked, "Will that matter in court?" Dr. Buss pulled a brick from the interior wall. She held it to the light. "This brick has a maker's stamp. Aldridge Play Works. That kiln closed in 1931. Every brick in this barn is irreplaceable." She handed it to Walter. "Bring this to court. Let the judge hold it. Let him feel what 100 years of craft feels like in his hand." Walter turned the brick over. It was heavier than he expected. The stamp was faint but readable. The mortar dust clung to his fingers like flour. He placed the brick on the kitchen table and didn't move it until the morning of the hearing. The morning of the final hearing, Craig Overmyer arrived early. He set up his model, arranged his binders, and tested his laptop's connection to the courtroom projector. Outside in the hallway, a reporter from the county paper asked him about the case. "It's straightforward," Craig said. "The structure fails on 9 of 12 inspection criteria. Mortar degradation alone is grounds for condemnation. The farmer can bring whatever he wants to court. Numbers don't change." He paused and added, "I've seen this before. People get attached to old buildings. But attachment isn't a structural argument." Inside the courtroom, he leaned toward his lead attorney and said, just loud enough for the second row to hear, "This'll be done by lunch." Now the final hearing had arrived. Judge Harlow opened the session at 9:14 a.m. The gallery was standing room only. 2 county commissioners sat in the back row. A woman in the third row held a hand-drawn sign that read, "Save the barn," but had been asked to put it away. The county presented first. Craig Overmyer walked the court through his report, load-bearing calculations, mortar compression tests, photographic evidence of separation between the north wall and the stone foundation. Each slide was clean, professional, and damning. The structure meets the threshold for immediate condemnation under Section 11(4) of the County Building Code, his attorney summarized. "We request the court uphold the demolition order." Judge Harlow nodded. "Defense." Darlene has stood. "Your Honor, we have one piece of evidence to present." The judge raised an eyebrow. One. Walter stood slowly. He picked up the brick from beneath the table. The courtroom watched as he walked to the evidence table and placed it carefully in the center. The sound it made against the polished wood, a dull, solid thud, carried through the silent room. Craig Overmyer leaned back slightly. "A brick," he said, half smiling. His attorney stood. "Your Honor, this is hardly—" "Sit down," Judge Harlow said. He looked at Darlene. "Explain." Darlene picked up the brick and turned it slowly. "This brick was removed from the interior wall of the Briggs barn last week. It is one of approximately 11,400 bricks in the structure." She pointed to a faint mark pressed into the base. "This is a maker's stamp. It reads Aldrich Clay Works, 1922. That brickyard closed in 1931. These bricks cannot be purchased, replicated, or sourced from anywhere. They exist only in structures built between 1919 and 1931 in this county." Craig frowned. His attorney scribbled a note. The gallery murmured. Darlene placed a 2-page lab report beside the brick. Mr. Overmyer tested the barn's mortar with a flathead screwdriver and concluded it was degraded. This report is from Dr. Patricia Voss, a materials historian at the State University. She read one line, "The mortar in the Briggs barn is lime-based, not Portland cement. Lime mortar is designed to flex, not harden. Testing it for compression strength using Portland cement standards is like measuring a fish's ability to climb a tree." A few people in the gallery exhaled audibly. One commissioner in the back row uncrossed his arms. Craig Overmyer opened his mouth, then closed it. His lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, the inspection followed state code." "I'm aware," Judge Harlow said. "Sit down." Darlene pressed a second document on the table. "This is the County Building Code, Section 11(4), which Mr. Overmyer cited. It was adopted in 1967. It applies to structures built with Portland cement, steel reinforcement, and post-war materials." She paused. "The Briggs barn was built in 1923 with hand-fired clay brick with lime mortar, with a stone foundation quarried on-site. Section 11(4) does not apply. It never applied. It was never written for buildings like this." The courtroom went still. Craig Overmyer's colleague closed her laptop. Craig stared straight ahead, his jaw tightened. Darlene placed one final sheet beside the brick. "This is State Statute 44.3, a 328. The Heritage Structures Preservation Act passed in 1991. It states that any structure built before 1940 using locally sourced materials and continuously maintained by the same family may not be condemned under post-1965 building codes without a heritage impact assessment. She looked at the judge. No heritage assessment was conducted. No heritage review was requested. The condemnation order was issued under a code that does not apply to the structure, using a test methodology that does not apply to the material, without the legally required assessment that applies to the building's age and provenance. She placed her hand on the brick. This single brick contains the maker's stamp, the mortar type, and the material origin that prove all 3 points. The courtroom didn't make a sound. Craig Overmyer sat perfectly still. His model of the barn, marked in red, sat untouched beside him. Judge Harlow removed his glasses. He looked at the brick for a long time. "The demolition order is vacated," he said. "The condemnation is reversed. The county will conduct a proper heritage assessment before any further action." He paused. "And the court suggests that the building inspector's office review its methodology for pre-war structures." The gavel came down once. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Someone patted Walter on the shoulder. "You beat the whole county with a brick," the man said. Walter shook his head. "I didn't beat anyone." "Then what was it?" Walter looked back toward the courthouse doors. "That brick was fired in a kiln my grandfather built with his own hands. The clay came from our south meadow. The mortar was mixed by men who are buried in the cemetery down the road." He paused. "You don't condemn a building by measuring it with the wrong ruler." A reporter from the county paper approached. "Mr. Briggs, were you worried about the outcome?" Walter thought for a moment. "The brick has been holding up that wall for 103 years. I figured it could hold up one more afternoon." 7 months later, the county quietly revised its inspection protocols. Pre-1940 structures would now require a heritage material specialist before any condemnation proceedings. Craig Overmyer requested a transfer to the adjacent county. It was granted without comment. Walter went back to work. The 87 acres stayed in the family. The barn roof was patched that summer by a crew that included Walter's grandson, who was 17 and had never swung a hammer on a scaffold before. He learned quickly, and the brick sat on a shelf in the barn's tack room, right next to a black and white photograph of Edwin Briggs standing beside the same wall in 1923, mortar still wet on his hands.